Mark Twain coined the term Gilded Age to refer to the time period between the Civil War and about 1900. During this time, things looked like they were golden on the outside, but on the inside, well, they weren't so good. Take, for example, all of the robber barons of the time. The term robber baron is referred to the tycoons who made billions of dollars on steel and oil and other things at the expense of the American public. Now, some people refer to them as captains of industry because they paved the way for others. However, the workers would probably say otherwise. Robber barons to know include Andrew Carnegie of steel, J.D. Rockefeller of oil, J.P. Morgan of banking, and Cornelius Vanderbilt of the railroads. These men formed trusts. Trusts were formed when one company took over the competing company's stock, and eventually you have some trust agreements formed. These trusts would lead to monopolies, where one individual would control basically the entire industry. That meant they could control prices and really anything else with steel or oil. Carnegie was able to form his trusts with vertical and horizontal integration. Vertical integration is when you control the ingredients that make up the trust, and horizontal integration is when you start to buy up the competing companies. The two combine to form one unbeatable trust. That's not to say that Carnegie was without charity. He did write a book called The Gospel of Wealth, where he talked about the importance of charity for the rich and how they should be involved in those charities. You might have heard of Carnegie Hall or Carnegie Mellon. Was it unfair that these rich people got so wealthy? Well, if you ask those who believed in social Darwinism, they would say no. Social Darwinism is the belief in survival of the fittest. Obviously, these men who controlled these trusts were fit to rule. Social Darwinism would also be used later when it came to imperialism and justifying taking over other countries. The Gilded Age would be synonymous with scandal. The Grant administration was one administration that had a lot of them, including the Credit Mobilier scandal, the salary grab, as well as the whiskey ring. However, most of the scandal would happen at a municipal or city level. This is where you would have Boss Tweed controlling the Tweed ring in New York City's Tammany Hall. This meant that Boss Tweed and his Democratic cronies could go around the city and control basically everything from public works to the court system to many other implements of society. This type of operation is called a political machine, and the reason why it's called a machine is because it churns out votes. Those votes help to keep Tweed and others in office. Immigrants who are new to the country, they are going to help with these votes. In return, the machine will promise to help them with something such as a job. During this time period, you're going to see the rise of unions. Unions fought for workers' rights. The first one to know is the Knights of Labor, controlled by Terence Powderly. The Knights were unskilled and they would strike quite often. The difference between them and the AFL is clear. The AFL is the American Federation of Labor. They are led by Samuel Gompers, and they would strike only when necessary. They fought for bread and butter issues such as wages and hours. Also, the AFL tended to be more skilled as a craft union. Forming by the turn of the century, you're going to see the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, also known as the Wobblies. They are led by Eugene V. Debs. Debs would be involved in a lot of strikes, and certainly the Gilded Age would have their share of strikes. In 1877, you see the great upheaval of the railroad strike. This occurred when wages were cut for one railroad and many of the other railroad lines went on strike. President Hayes had to break this one up. Many presidents are not going to be on the side of labor during the Gilded Age. Another example of a strike would be in 1894, the Pullman strike. The Pullman strike saw Eugene V. Debs telling all of the trains to stop running if they were carrying Pullman cars. Pullman cars were luxury cars that would be attached to the train. Wages again were cut, and this one was going to be broken up by President Grover Cleveland. Cleveland got an injunction or a court order to break up the strike when he said that the strike was interfering with interstate commerce. That's because mail was on those trains. And if mail can't be delivered, well, that strike had to be broken up. In 1886, you are going to see the Haymarket Affair. The Haymarket Affair was when a strike was taking place in Chicago and a bomb went off in the crowd. Immigrants were blamed for this, and anarchism became the fear of the day. This is when people were against the government. Immigrants were coming over at this time. Many of them were taking on the roles of union leaders, and this is going to lead to a decrease in unionization and a fear of unions. Fear of immigrants would take place in the Homestead strike of 1892. This is where at Carnegie's steel plant, Ben wanted to unionize, and that led to resistance, and eventually that plan failed. There was even violence ensuing at the actual steel plant. There were some acts that were passed during the Gilded Age to try to control the corruption. You have the Pendleton Act in 1883. That gets rid of patronage, which was the old spoils system of Andrew Jackson. It's replaced now with a test that you would have to take called the Civil Service Exam. In addition, in 1890, you have the Sherman Antitrust Act. That was supposed to get rid of anything that was in, quote, restraint of trade. Restraint of trade meant trusts, you would think. However, a lot of union activity was broken up because of restraint to trade. So whereas the intent was to break up the trusts, that really didn't happen so much until the Progressive era between 1890 to 1920. Another law that comes out is the Interstate Commerce Act, which creates the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission. That was supposed to break up the unfair practices of the railroads. We talked a lot about all of the bad things about the Gilded Age, but there were some important inventions. For example, you have the Bessemer process, which got rid of the impurities in the steel-making process. That meant that steel was now readily available for bridges, as well as the skyscrapers, which were going to start to dot the landscape of Chicago and New York City. The Transcontinental Railroad, as we will speak about in our West video, that was created in 1869, and it linked the country. It was the biggest project the government had ever been a part of. In addition, you should know about Alexander Graham Bell. You have the telephone being invented during this time, which is going to increase the amount of communications, and some massive building projects that we see, such as the Brooklyn Bridge. It's going to be completed in 1883, which is going to link both New York to Brooklyn. And of course, who could forget about the invention of electricity, as we're going to see the light bulb being improved upon by Thomas Edison, and the expansion of electricity to America's cities first and then later to rural areas. The Gilded Age is going to lead to a lot of people questioning their government and calling for reform. Those reforms are going to take place during what's called the Progressive era, which is going to be roughly between 1890 to 1920.